I started building my cabin back in 2009, so 15 years ago. And one of the challenges that I faced, and it's, well, not one that everybody wants to talk about, but I had to figure out what to do with the bathroom. One of my, let's say, primary goals for building our cabin was to make sure that my wife was comfortable. And while I was okay with using a privy or an outhouse, I'll admit, I like not having to go outside when it's 20 below out, and my wife wanted an indoor bathroom. Can you blame her? So I had to do a bunch of research, and I spent a lot of time just trying to determine what would be the best course of action. And I looked at incinerating toilets, I looked at composting toilets, I looked at septic systems, which frankly were too expensive for my budget, and of course the old privy, and even do-it-yourself options. There are lots of do-it-yourself composting toilet options, for example. But I settled on the Sun-Mar Centrex 2000 AC/DC composting toilet because it's a little bit different. Instead of having a composting toilet in your bathroom, the actual whole bin and everything that I always kind of figured you'd have to haul out through the house when you empty, I didn't want to do that. I really didn't want to do that. I didn't like the idea of taking a finishing drawer full of human manure, which is what they call it, and hauling it through the house. So I opted for the Centrex 2000 because that's basically a central type system where you could actually have more than one toilet going to the main unit. Now, I didn't need more than one toilet, but what I wanted was the main unit, not inside the cabin. So you just have a toilet inside the cabin. That was my goal, and I went to Sun-Mar, and actually the founder of Sun-Mar started developing composting toilets back in the mid to late 70s. So Sun-Mar's been around a very, very long time, and they claim that they set the standard for composting toilets. I'm not going to tell you they do. I can't really say one way or another. But what I can tell you is that they had the right unit at the right price with the right reviews. All of that made a lot of sense to me. I didn't like the idea of an incinerating toilet. You had to always burn stuff. I didn't like the idea of the self-contained inside the cabin units, though I would do that for some cabins, for a small guest cabin or something. I think I'd probably do that. I would probably put in some sort of small door, like a cat door type thing or something, that I could put the compost bin out when I want to empty instead of having to haul it through the whole cabin, but I don't know. Hard to say. In this video, I'm going to give you the good, the bad, and the ugly of using a composting toilet in hopes that it'll help you decide whether you want one or not. Now, before we continue, I'm going to explain what a composting toilet is, but I'm also going to let you know that I'm not going to show any gross stuff or anything like that. So I'm not going to stick a camera inside a composting toilet so you can have a look at it. So if you're looking for that kind of stuff, wrong channel. But in any case, let's talk about composting toilets, and by the time this video is done, I will have given you what I would call the good, the bad, and the ugly of the Sun-Mar Centrex 2000 composting toilet. But I think that you'll find that the things that I talk about, which might surprise you, are going to be the same for all composting toilets, at least all wet toilets. And there is a difference between a dry composting toilet and a wet composting toilet. So let's discuss composting toilets real quick first. And don't worry, I'll make it fairly quick. A composting toilet is simply a toilet that you use like you would any other toilet, except that the waste goes into a bin where there are microbes and where you add bulking material, which could be wood chips or peat moss or that kind of stuff. And you put that bulking material and those microbes into a rotating drum, though if people make their own, it's usually in buckets and no thanks. But you put it into a rotating drum so that after you do your business, you add a little bit more bulking material and you rotate the drum. Now, to be clear, my unit, the Centrex unit, you don't add the bulking material right away. If you're using a unit that's a self-contained unit inside your bathroom where everything's in there, then you would. And I think for dry units, that's what you do. They don't have a wet flush. So they're a little bit different, and I can't really speak of those. But on my unit, you just use your bathroom like you normally would. But then, after a period of time, a weekend in my case typically, or a couple weekends, you go out to the exterior unit, that's one of the bonuses, the goods, and you add your bulking material and you rotate the drum. And the rotating obviously just mixes things up. Now, if you've been using the composting toilet a while, which, we've been using ours for 14 years, then to prevent it from filling up completely, which, by the way, I've got to tell you, one of the good things is it's never done that. because the composting breaks everything down so well, there's really not much material once you've used it for months even. But what you do periodically, and it depends on whether you're living with it or just using it on weekends. If you're living with it, I think they say every 2 weeks. If you're on weekends, well, you can figure about 14 days worth of use, which could take a while. But then what you do is you rotate the drum backwards, and that, excuse the expression, dumps a load into the finishing drawer. Now that sounds pretty gross, but it's actually not, and that's one of the good things. It doesn't really smell. You don't really notice it. So you run that back into the finishing drawer, and then you rotate the drum normally again, and you walk away. And a couple, 2-3 weeks later or whatever, you dump that finishing drawer somewhere. Now the somewhere, that's not really a good, bad, or ugly. It's just a choice. You could dig a pit and dump it all in there if you wanted to. You could dump it in an outhouse if you had one. Or you could just dump it in a composting pile that you know is not a compost pile that you would use for example, root vegetables. Anything that's going to touch the compost, you don't want to use it for that. So you're not going to put it in your garden. You could put it in the garden where you have things that aren't going to touch that, but personally, I would do it in like around fruit trees or something like that, or out in the forest or whatever. I just happen to have an area that's about 3 feet by 3 feet that I use, and the truth of the matter is, you wouldn't even know today that for 14 years I've been doing that. You wouldn't know, because it doesn't build up. So the basics of using a composting toilet like this one is pretty simple. You've got a toilet, you got a flush valve, and whether you hook up the flush valve or not, because guess what? I never hooked the water up. I have the valve to hook the water up, and I just keep not doing it. We use a cup. Just put a couple cups of water in, use the toilet, flush the toilet, you're done. That's a composting toilet. It's fairly simple. Now, why did I choose a composting toilet? I mentioned it earlier. I didn't want to go out to an outhouse. Outhouses are frankly smelly, so you don't want one really close to your cabin, right? When it's cold out, you gotta go out there. When it's dark, right? There's no other options. You could do what we did when I was like 2. We moved to Vanderhoof, British Columbia, up in central BC from Oregon, where we were living. It got so cold up there that in the winter, and believe it or not, the first winter, my parents say it was down to 67 degrees below zero. And that's not with a wind chill factor. But it got so cold that nobody would want to go out to an outhouse. So my parents used a 5-gallon bucket as a toilet, and would just put it out on the porch and let it freeze. And they could go dump the poop sickle, if you will, out in the outhouse during the day when it wasn't 67 below zero. It might have only been 40, so it warmed up. That's 40 below zero. But in any case, those are things I didn't want to do. And I didn't want to deal with an incinerating toilet. I know a lot of people use those, but that takes fuel. You got to actually burn stuff. And that means you've got something inside your cabin that you're burning stuff in, which I guess you could think of it like a wood stove, but I just thought it had kind of an ick factor. And I was in the military. Burning waste, human waste, in, big drums of diesel or whatever, seemed pretty gross. Like, I didn't want to do that. And frankly, my wife didn't really want to be involved in those kind of things either. And we had used things like porta pots and whatever, and those are okay for temporary use on a short-term basis if you're out camping or wheeling or something like that, or building a cabin. But it isn't something that you want to do in your cabin all the time, right? So initially, I will admit that there were some things that I was kind of skeptical about. For one, smell. I really didn't like the idea of a smelly toilet in my house, or even behind it. I didn't like that idea. And I didn't really like the idea of having to deal with composted human waste, quite frankly, right? Like, gross. Who wants to deal with that? And in the beginning, I had it installed outdoors, which meant it would freeze in the wintertime. And if you allow the flushing mechanism to not work very well because the pipes are really cold, that can create some pretty gross smells when it comes to things thawing out. So one of the bads, I would say, is at about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, if you don't make sure that things flush all the way down, maybe you do your business, you do your flush, close the lid, and away you go, and you don't check, it could be really bad, and it could be one of the uglies. Meaning that waste that you just put in your big old sewage pipe, if it freezes, if the liquids flash freeze to the pipe, it stops everything up. Couple, 2, 3 people go to the bathroom, or you go a couple, 2 or 3 times, and guess what? you've just plugged up your sewage pipe that goes into your composting toilet. Then, if you don't pay attention and it freezes solid, when you thaw it out, you will be venting out your cabin. Trust me, it is gross. It is not good. So that's ugly. So let's talk about the good first. Okay, I said this is the good, the bad, the ugly. So good, regular toilet in your bathroom. So you have a normal-like bathroom. The composting drum doesn't smell. I really don't notice a smell. I was surprised by that fairly early on. It composts the waste down considerably. Even though you're putting bulking material in, it basically darn near disappears. When you think you should have a 55-gallon drum full of waste, you might have 5 gallons or 10, but that's it. The finishing drawer operation is simple and easy, and it doesn't smell, and it doesn't even look gross. So dealing with the finishing drawer was simple. All in all, a composting toilet like the Centrex 2000, the AC/DC unit, it works pretty well. And you really don't have a bunch of issues with it. But there are some issues that I would call the bad and the ugly. One of the things that I would say is a bit of an issue is that on the AC/DC or the DC only units, you have a 90 millimeter computer style fan that is inserted into a 4-inch vent pipe. And the vent pipe comes out of the composting toilet, and you ostensibly install it so that it sits about 3 feet above the roof line or wherever you're installing it, so that when the composting gases are exhausted out of that vent stack, and of course you're dehydrating your black water inside the unit, so that those gases go somewhere and that those vapors go somewhere, they go up that pipe. That 90 millimeter computer fan keeps turning all the time. It runs off of 12 volts and it turns 24/7, 365 to help keep things moving. Basically to keep those gases moving and to keep the vapors moving and to dehydrate the liquids at the base of the drum. So one of the issues that I've had with that is that those fans go bad. And if you're lucky and you hear that that fan has gone bad, then you can replace it. But when I put this unit in, there's no special place that that fan goes. It essentially goes between two 4-inch pipes. You have PVC pipes, they've got a bell, and you put the fan between the two of them. Well, when it goes bad, you got to replace it. The only way to replace it is to pull the pipe up, pull the fan out, put a new one in, set it back down. Personally, I think that Sun-Mar could put in some sort of cassette-style fan that would be a lot easier to replace. Maybe a slot of some kind that you can just set a 90 millimeter fan in and stick her back in and away you go. That would make more sense because these fans do go out, and I've had them go out anywhere from 1 year to 2 or 3 or 4 years in service. Depends on the quality of the fan. And if you buy them off of Amazon or somewhere like that, well, you never know. I've had one in there now for over 5 years. It seems to be still working, but quite frankly, it could be stopped working and I wouldn't even know because I don't hear it. Now that is part of the good, I suppose, in that you don't have to have the fan. The fan helps, makes the unit more efficient, it works better, but you don't have to have it. I prefer having it because of one of the reasons I'll discuss later. That's in the ugly part. Now, obviously, you have to put the bulking material in. That means that you've got to be able to go to that unit, open it up, rotate the drum backwards a little bit so that you have access to where all the waste is, and you got to put the bulking material in there. I call that a bad because that is the one and only time that if you're going to get an odor, that's probably where you're going to get it. I can't say that I usually do, but sometimes you do. But it just seems like a gross thing to do, right? I mean, it's not. It's perfectly fine. It's perfectly hygienic. Nothing wrong with doing it, and you can learn to live with it. But it's kind of, I just wish I didn't have to. But the only way to not have to would be to have sewage or a septic tank, which is a lot more expensive. And there's no sewage where I'm at. So that's kind of one of those things. Obviously, you've got to dump it into a finishing drawer and then take that finishing drawer out of the unit and dump that somewhere. Well, again, you're dealing with human waste. So you're going to put gloves on. It seems kind of gross, but it's really not, actually. I mean, it doesn't smell, doesn't really, it's just something you have to do. So is that really bad? Not really, but it's one of the things that I would put in the less than good category. How about that? One of the bad things is that depending on how well you are managing and maintaining your composting unit, it can get flies, which means you've got to deal with those. You may need to add more bulking material to dry out the drum a little bit, or you may need to do one of the gross things that is probably the number one gross, ugly type things that you have to do with a composting toilet like this one. So this is the chief ugly in my good, bad, and the ugly. The way these composting systems work is you have essentially like a 50-gallon drum or whatever it is, 30, 40, 50 gallons. It has an opening on the top, and your sewage pipe comes in and goes to that opening. So when the drum is sitting in the normal position, which is that opening going up, all the waste goes into the drum. When you're going to go out and add material, you rotate it backwards so that opening is towards a door that you open up, and you dump your bulking material. Then you rotate the drum 7 or 8 times to make sure everything's mixed up, and you leave it, okay? But one of the things that happens is some of that bulking material, some of the solids, can drop through the screens and go down into the base of the unit, which is your black water, for lack of better term, call it tray or tank, right? It's the main body, but it's built like a tank at the bottom, and it's a holding tank for black water. And that holding tank has a black water overflow that you would put out to a French drain somewhere, okay? Well, the problem is some of that waste, some of the bulking material, drops down into that space, and there's no easy access to it. So what you have to do when this happens, and it's something you're going to have to do at least probably annually unless you don't use it very often, is you're going to have to pull the finishing drawer out and dump that, of course, and then set the finishing drawer aside, and they give you a rake that's about this long, which is kind of long enough, with like a hoe on one side and a rake on the other, sort of like a garden hoe and a garden rake in one unit, and a hook that you can hang it up or whatever. And you have to stick that in there, which you don't have a whole lot of room to operate. I'm not talking like you can just go like this, right? You've got an opening on the side, but you need to stick that rake down the unit all the way down to where the black water overflow drain is, and then pull that waste, all the solids that you can, back towards where the finishing drawer is, or was, because you've taken it out so that you can do this. And then you've got to get some kind of shovel or a spade, like a garden shovel or something, and scoop all that out and put it into the finishing drawer so that you could finish it off and get rid of it later. Now, it doesn't smell bad, frankly, right? It's not really a noticeable smell to it, maybe a little bit, but nothing major. It's just gross. It's ugly. And that is something that you have to do. So, of the chief ugly things, that's numero uno. On one hand, composting toilets are very, very useful. I'm actually really happy we put one in. I'm not going to say I love it, because who loves a toilet, right? But I'm going to tell you that if you're building a cabin in the woods and you're looking at options and you're trying to decide, do I want an incinerator? Do I want a composter? Do I want an outhouse privy type setup? Or can I afford to put in septic, right? If you're looking at those options, then I'm going to tell you right now that a composting toilet is a good option. It's a very good option. It works great. Now, because you don't have septic, it does mean you have to install a gray water drain system for your gray water. That's your laundry, you're washing your hands, you're doing your dishes, whatever. That's all going to go somewhere else. And I could talk about that in another video and tell you what I did there. But as far as a composting toilet goes, the Sun-Mar Centrex 2000 AC/DC unit that we've had has been in use for 14 years. And outside of 90mm fans quitting once in a while, I've actually not had a problem with it. Sure, I've had to clean it out once. One time I had to clean it out because it went sour. And that is something that could happen if you don't treat it well. Maybe you put chlorinated water in it, which I don't have, so I'm not doing. But there was a time where I cleaned out my cistern and used a little chlorine to really clean it out good. I had to make sure I didn't use that water in my composting toilet, because you can't do that. Chlorine kills bugs. Now, some of the things that you might want to consider is that with a composting toilet, you do have to buy bulking material, which you can get online easily enough. And I've, in the past, bought it by the pallet. You do need to get compost quick, because you don't want to clean your toilet with a harsh chemical, because that can kill bugs. You don't want that. So Sun-Mar in particular sells something called Compost Quick. I'm sure others do too. It not only helps the compost action happen, but it's a good cleaning agent as well, a safe one to use. And then you also have microbes, and you can buy microbes where you throw a couple scoops in your toilet, flush it down periodically, sometimes every 2 weeks or every couple months or whatever. I've never really managed to pay attention to how often I do it. I just do it periodically, but the composter works, so I'm not worried about it. And one of the other things that you have to consider is that you have to keep a composting toilet above 50 degrees because composting doesn't take place under 50 degrees, and some would argue 55. You could use it in a freezing environment, in a cold winter environment, as long as you're not using it a lot. But it can work like a holding tank. You just don't want to fill it up, of course. But it's better to keep it above 55 degrees. And that is one of the main reasons I have the back room at the cabin that we built to house it and put a heater in there. And that room is super insulated, and it really doesn't take a lot of propane to keep it above freezing so the composting toilet works year round, but it is something that you have to do. Now, I will tell you that, you know, if there was a moment where you had the light bulb come on and it was just pivotal in terms of whether you were happy about getting a composting toilet or not, quite frankly, it was the first time that toilet was put into use. Because it was just like using a regular toilet, mostly. Okay, a little bit different, but not much. It works great. You don't have to have running water to use it, though we do have running water. I've actually never hooked it up to the toilet. I keep saying I'm going to, but we found that having one of those 16-ounce camp mugs on a bathroom sink, just fill it up with water, dump it in there, do your thing, fill it up again, help flush it down, you're done. So that was pivotal. It was like this amazing thing, like, wow, I don't have to go anywhere. I got a bathroom right here and it doesn't smell. So if you're looking for a composting toilet, I will tell you this video is not sponsored, but I really do think that the Sun-Mar Centrex 2000 or their bigger units in both AC and DC or AC-DC units are absolutely worth the money. I see today they run about $2,000, so they're not cheap, folks. Obviously, an outhouse is much cheaper. Incinerator type units, I didn't look up pricing, but they could be cheaper too. But frankly, I think that the unit that I have is an excellent unit, and I could run a second toilet to it if I wanted to. I think that's a pretty good bonus to have with these kinds of setups. So it does work very well. It's not really an issue. The ugly stuff is rare to deal with. The bad stuff is not very often you deal with that. 14 years. Not really that many times I've had too many flies or I've had to deal with the black water underneath it or anything like that. So it's pretty simple to use. But let me know what you think. Are you thinking about going to a composting toilet? Do you already have one? Are you using an incinerator or just an outhouse? Let me know what you're doing. What a great topic, right? And folks, if you like these videos and you want to see more, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell because it'll let you know when the next video comes out. I really do appreciate your all being here today. I'm going to drop another video over here for you to check out. Thanks for watching, folks. The old Jarhead out.